A single word whispered in a room built on the currency of silence can be more devastating than a market crash. For Clara Sullivan, a 20-year-old art history student paying her tuition by serving overpriced delicacies to men who wouldn't notice if their food was made of gold leaf or sawdust, that word was a technical term from a dead man's workshop. For Julian Sterling, the 35-year-old scion of an empire built on precision and time, it was the first tremor of an earthquake that would bring a century of gilded lies crashing down around him. She was just trying to survive another 6-hour shift at Ethelgard, a restaurant so exclusive its name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones. He was just another titan of industry, his face a mask of bored authority carved from inherited wealth. But when the cuff of his bespoke suit shifted, revealing the timepiece on his wrist, a ghost from Clara's past rose from its grave, and its cold fingers were about to wind the clock back to a moment of unforgivable sin. This is not a story about a girl meeting a prince. This is the story of how a quiet observation about a watch's escapement in a Michelin-starred mausoleum became the key that unlocked a secret betrayal, a stolen legacy, and a truth the most powerful family in New York thought they had buried forever. The air in Ethelgard was a carefully curated symphony of hushed murmurs, the gentle clink of Christoffel silverware against Bernardo porcelain, and the almost imperceptible hum of a climate control system that cost more than Clara's entire college education. She moved through the landscape of dark wood and muted gold upholstery like a phantom, her black uniform designed to make her invisible. Invisibility was a skill here. You refilled water glasses without being seen, cleared plates without being heard, and anticipated the whims of the financial gods at your tables without ever making eye contact unless specifically addressed. Tonight, Table 7 was Julian Sterling. Clara knew the name, of course. Sterling Tower scraped the sky over Midtown, a monument to the family's dominance in manufacturing and technology. Julian Sterling's face, with its sharp jawline and eyes the color of a winter sky, was a regular feature in the Wall Street Journal. He exuded a kind of gravitational pull. The space around him seemed to bend to his will. He ate alone, not with the loneliness of the unwanted, but with the focused solitude of a predator. Clara approached the table to clear his appetizer plate. "Will there be anything else for you this evening, Mr. Sterling?" she asked, her voice the practiced, neutral tone of perfect service. He didn't look up from the document he was reading on his tablet. "Just the bill." "Of course, sir." As she reached for the plate, his hand moved to shift the tablet. The starched white cuff of his shirt slid back, and for a fleeting second, the watch on his wrist was revealed in its full glory. Clara froze. It wasn't the platinum case or the subtle gleam of the alligator strap that stopped her. It was the face, the dial, a stunning deep cobalt blue with a guilloche pattern that wasn't the standard sunburst or hobnail. It was a unique, intricate wave pattern, radiating from the center like ripples in water. And the movement, visible through a small aperture at the 6 o'clock position, the tourbillon cage was shaped like a tiny stylized lyre. But it was the escapement, the very heart of the watch that made her breath catch in her throat. She could see the distinct, almost organic curve of the anchor pallet. It was a coaxial escapement, but not one she had ever seen in a modern timepiece. It was his. The design was seared into her memory. She had seen it 1,000 times, not on a billionaire's wrist, but in faded graphite sketches on brittle parchment paper in her grandfather's dusty workshop. She had held the prototype in her own hands, a heavy, non-functional piece of brass and steel her grandfather had machined himself decades ago, a relic of a dream he never spoke of. Arthur Vance, her grandfather, had been a watchmaker, not a seller of Swiss brands in a fancy boutique, but a true horologist, a man who smelled of machine oil and metal polish, whose greatest joy was the precise, patient assembly of gears and springs. He had passed away 2 years ago, leaving behind a small, debt-ridden house, a workshop full of silent tools, and a quiet, heartbroken grandmother now fading away in a nursing home, whose bills were a rising tide of panic for Clara. The words left her mouth before the professional filter of Ethelgard's training could stop them. It was a whisper, barely audible, laced with a disbelief that bordered on reverence. "Excuse me, sir." The escapement on your timepiece. My grandfather designed one just like it. Julian Sterling stilled. For a full 3 seconds, he didn't move. Then he slowly lifted his head, and his glacial blue eyes met hers. The bored dismissal was gone, replaced by a sharp, analytical focus. It was the look of a man who spots an anomaly in a line of code, an unexpected variable in a flawless equation. I beg your pardon? His voice was low, resonant, and held a distinct edge of warning. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The restaurant manager, a severe man named Mr. Dubois, was already gliding in their direction, sensing a disruption in the carefully controlled atmosphere. She knew she should apologize, retreat, become invisible again. But the image of her grandfather's worn hands, the sketches, the pride in his eyes as he explained the revolutionary efficiency of his design, it all surged forward. "The watch," she stammered, gesturing with a trembling hand. "The Valerius Continuum. The wave-pattern guilloche on the dial, the lyre-shaped tourbillon cage, and the escapement. It's a modified coaxial with a 3-tiered pallet fork. My grandfather, Arthur Vance, he invented it. He called it the Seraphim escapement." A flicker of something unreadable crossed Julian's face. It wasn't shock. It was darker, harder, annoyance. He slowly, deliberately, placed his hand flat on the white tablecloth, the watch a silent, gleaming accusation. "That's impossible," he said. The words were not an argument. They were a verdict. The Valerius Continuum was a custom commissioned by my grandfather, Alistair Sterling, in 1965. It is a unique piece, one of one. The movement was designed in-house by Sterling Industries' top horologists. The name you just mentioned, Vance, has never been associated with my family's company. His finality was a brick wall. He was not just correcting her. He was erasing her grandfather's existence from the story. The injustice of it, piled onto the stress of her tuition, the grief for her grandfather, and the constant, grinding worry for her grandmother, ignited a spark of defiance. "I'm not mistaken," she said, her voice dropping, but gaining a firmness that surprised even herself. "I've held the schematics. I've seen the prototypes. He spent 20 years perfecting that escapement. He said it would change modern horology." Julian Sterling leaned back in his chair. A faint, condescending smile touched the corner of his mouth, but did not reach his eyes. "A charming piece of family folklore, Miss Sullivan, Clara Sullivan." "Well, Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice turning to ice, "your grandfather was either a delusional plagiarist or you are a very imaginative storyteller. Now, if you'll excuse me." He gestured dismissively toward the bill on the table. Mr. Dubois had arrived, his face a mask of apologetic fury. "Mr. Sterling, I am so terribly sorry for this disturbance. The girl is new. I will handle this immediately." But Julian's cold, dismissive gaze remained on Clara. It was a challenge. He was a man who lived in a world of facts, figures, and legal documents. Her story was an unsubstantiated anecdote, an annoying bit of static in his well-ordered universe. "My grandfather kept journals," Clara heard herself say, the words a desperate last stand. "He documented everything. He built a second one." This finally seemed to pierce his armor of certainty. The condescending smile vanished. "A second one?" "A perfect duplicate," she said, her voice shaking with the magnitude of what she was claiming. "It was his proof, his legacy. It's in his workshop." Julian Sterling stared at her for a long, unnerving moment. He seemed to be weighing her, calculating odds, assessing risk. He reached into his jacket, but instead of a wallet, he pulled out a slim, elegant business card. He placed it on the table. "You have 24 hours to prove it," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Bring this supposed duplicate and your grandfather's journals to my office at 9 a.m. tomorrow. If you are telling the truth, we will have a conversation. If this is some kind of poorly conceived shakedown..." He let the threat hang in the air, more potent for being unspoken. He stood, dropped several $100 bills on the table, and walked out of the restaurant without a backward glance. The invisible curtain of his presence lifted, and the ambient hum of the room seemed to rush back in. Mr. Dubois turned on her, his face pale with rage. "You are fired, of course. Clean out your locker, now." Clara didn't even hear him. She stood frozen, Julian Sterling's card feeling as heavy as a block of platinum in her hand. She hadn't just lost her job. She had picked a fight with a giant, armed with nothing but a dead man's story and a memory of gears and springs. And she had a horrifying feeling that in trying to reclaim her grandfather's legacy, she might have just endangered what little her family had left. The nursing home smelled of antiseptic, overcooked vegetables, and a faint lingering sadness. Clara found her grandmother, Eleanor Vance, in a worn armchair by the window, staring out at a small, manicured garden that felt more like a cage. Alzheimer's was a thief, stealing memories piece by piece, but some things remained, locked away in the deeper vaults of the mind. Her grandfather's work was one of them. "Grandma," Clara said softly, kneeling beside the chair, "I need to ask you about Grandpa Arthur's workshop, about the watches." Eleanor turned her head, her faded blue eyes so much like Clara's own, taking a moment to focus. "Arthur," she whispered, the name a sigh. "He's in his shop, always in his shop, tinkering, making time." Clara took her grandmother's frail, paper-thin hand. "Grandma, I saw a watch today. The one he was so proud of, the one with the special heart. A man was wearing it." A shadow passed over Eleanor's face. Fear. A deep, ancient fear that the disease had not been able to erase. "No," she said, her grip on Clara's hand tightening with surprising strength. "He put it away. He locked the door. They told him to forget. They were not nice men, Clara. They came to the house." Clara's blood ran cold. "Who came to the house, Grandma? What did they say?" "Men in dark suits, from the city," Eleanor murmured, her gaze drifting back to the window, back in time. "They spoke to Arthur in his study. There was shouting. Not from Arthur, he never shouted. From them. They said his ideas belonged to them now. They showed him papers. Pictures." Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "They had pictures of you, Clara, at the playground. You were so small." The story Clara had always suspected, the unspoken tragedy that haunted the edges of her family, was suddenly horribly real. This wasn't a business deal gone wrong. It was a mugging. "They told him to be quiet," Eleanor continued, her eyes filling with tears. "For his family. They gave him money. Blood money, Arthur called it. He never touched a penny of it. He put the box in the bank and told me to never speak of it again. He was a broken man after that day." The light in his hands went out. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her brilliant, gentle grandfather hadn't been outmaneuvered in business. He had been threatened, coerced into signing away his life's work to protect his wife and granddaughter. Clara left the nursing home with a burning resolve. She drove to her grandparents' small, silent house, the key feeling strange in her hand. The workshop was at the back of the garage, left exactly as it was the day he died. It was a sanctuary of order, tools hanging on pegboards in neat silhouettes, tiny labeled drawers full of screws and jewels, the scent of oil and old wood still lingering in the air. Behind a heavy workbench, under a loose floorboard, she knew from childhood games of hide and seek, was a small steel lockbox. Her hands trembled as she worked the combination, one she'd watched him dial 100 times. His wedding anniversary. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded black velvet, lay the watch. It was identical to Julian Sterling's. The same platinum case, the same cobalt dial with the wave guilloche, the same lyre-shaped tourbillon. It was heavier, though, and silent. He had never put the final mainspring in it. It was a perfect body without a heartbeat. Beneath it were the journals, dozens of them, filled with his small, precise handwriting, complex mathematical equations, and exquisitely detailed technical drawings. Clara spent the next 4 hours poring over the entries. It was all there. The initial spark of the idea for the Seraphim escapement, the years of trial and error, and then the story of his partnership. The name appeared again and again, Alistair Sterling. They hadn't been rivals. They had been partners. Arthur, the reclusive genius watchmaker from Brooklyn, and Alistair, the ambitious young heir with capital and a vision for a new kind of American luxury brand. The journals spoke of shared dreams, of building a company together. Arthur would be the head of research and development, Alistair, the face and the force of the business. The Valerius Continuum was to be their debut, a masterpiece to announce their arrival to the world. Then the tone of the journals shifted. Alistair grew distant, Meetings were canceled. Then came the visit from the men in dark suits, who were not lawyers from Sterling Industries, but fixers. The final entry on the matter was stark, written in a shaky hand so unlike her grandfather's usual precision. October 12th, 1965. He has stolen it all. My work, our dream. He has used my family against me. I have signed the papers. I am nobody. He has left me with silence and this silver ghost on my workbench. May it one day testify to the truth. I have failed. Clara closed the last journal, tears of rage and sorrow streaming down her face. Julian Sterling hadn't just been wearing a watch. He was wearing her family's stolen future on his wrist. Miles away in a penthouse that was more sky than room, Julian Sterling paced before a wall of glass overlooking the sleeping city. The waitress, Clara Sullivan, had unsettled him. It wasn't her story. It was her specificity. Three-tiered palette fork, seraphim escapement. These were not words a grifter pulled from thin air. He prided himself on logic, on data. His family's history was meticulously documented. He pulled up the digital archives of Sterling Industries on a large monitor. He searched for Arthur Vance. 0 results. He searched the financial records for any payments made to him in the mid-1960s. Nothing. It was clean. Too clean. His grandfather, Alistair Sterling, was a legend, a titan who built an empire from the ground up. The story of the Continuum was a cornerstone of that legend. How Alistair, driven by a passion for horology, had personally overseen a secret in-house team to create a watch that would rival the Swiss. It was a story of American ingenuity and singular vision. Julian's phone chimed. It was Marcus Thorne, the CEO of the Sterling Foundation, and the family's longtime confidant and fixer, a man whose father had served Alistair in the same capacity. The matter at Ethelgard has been handled, Marcus said, his voice smooth as polished granite. The waitress has been dismissed. I've had our legal team draft a cease and desist. A standard shakedown attempt, Julian? Nothing to worry about. She knew the technical specifications, Marcus, Julian said, his voice tight. Intimate details. There was a brief pause. Desperate people do their research. She likely found some old trade publication or a rejected patent filing and built a story around it. I'll have my team dig deeper, but I assure you it will lead nowhere. The Sterling narrative is ironclad. The Sterling narrative. The phrase hung in the air. Julian had never thought to question it. It was the bedrock of his identity. But the girl's eyes, they hadn't held cunning. They held the conviction of absolute truth. She claims to have a duplicate watch and journals, Julian said. She's bringing them to my office tomorrow morning. Another pause, this one longer, colder. That is unfortunate, Marcus said, his voice losing some of its smoothness. Allow me to handle it, Julian. It's not appropriate for you to meet with someone like her. I will vet her claims and make this problem disappear. No, Julian said, a sudden, unfamiliar instinct for distrust flaring up. I will handle this one myself. I need to see it with my own eyes. After he hung up, Julian walked to a large climate-controlled vault set into one of the walls. He entered a code and the heavy door swung open. Inside, among other family heirlooms, was a safe. He opened it. There, on a velvet pillow, lay Alistair Sterling's most prized possession, the original Valerius Continuum. He picked it up. It was his watch's identical twin. His grandfather had bequeathed it to him on his deathbed. Time is the only true currency, Julian, Alistair had whispered, his voice a dry rustle. And our name is the only true asset. Protect them both, at any cost. Now holding the watch, Julian felt a sliver of doubt, not in his grandfather's ambition, but in his methods. He had told the girl to prove her story. Now, with a grim sense of unease, he realized he had to do the same. He had to prove his own. The next morning, Clara Sullivan walked into the lobby of Sterling Tower. She was dressed not in a waitress uniform, but in a simple, neat dress, her shoulders squared, her expression resolute. She carried a worn leather satchel. She looked small and utterly out of place amidst the soaring marble and brushed steel, a field mouse in a lion's den. But when the elevator doors opened on the 95th floor into Julian Sterling's impossibly vast office, she did not flinch. Julian was standing by the window, his back to her. He turned as she entered. Marcus Thorne was there too, standing near the desk, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of paternal concern and undisguised hostility. "Miss Sullivan," Julian said, his voice neutral. "You came." "I told you I would," Clara replied, her voice steady. She walked to the massive mahogany desk and gently placed the satchel upon it. From it, she took the silent, heavy watch and laid it on a soft cloth she'd brought. Then she placed the top journal beside it. Marcus Thorne let out a short, dismissive laugh. "A clever replica. You can buy these knockoffs in any back alley downtown. This is a waste of your time, Julian." Julian ignored him. His eyes were fixed on the watch. He walked slowly toward the desk, his gaze intense. He reached out and picked it up, his expression unreadable. He turned it over and over in his hands. He produced a watchmaker's loop from his desk drawer, a habit inherited from his grandfather, and examined the dial, the casing, the flawless finish. "It's perfect," he murmured, almost to himself. "The weight is right. The finishing is immaculate." He looked at Clara. "You said it doesn't run." "He never completed the assembly," Clara said. "He said its heart shouldn't beat until its story could be told." Julian placed the watch down and opened the journal. He read the first page, then the second. He saw the two names, Arthur Vance and Alistair Sterling, linked together. He saw the sketches, the elegant, flowing script detailing a shared dream. His face, a carefully constructed mask of control, began to crumble. He looked up from the page, his eyes locking with Clara's, and in them, she saw the first crack in the foundation of his world. "This," he began, his voice hoarse. "This is my grandfather's handwriting, in the margins, his notes." Marcus Thorne's composure finally broke. He strode forward, snatching the journal from Julian's hand. "This is an outrageous forgery, a pathetic attempt to slander a great man's name." "Is it, Marcus?" Julian said, his voice dangerously low. He walked to his own vault, opened it, and returned with Alistair's Continuum. He placed it on the desk beside Arthur's. They were perfect twins. "Explain this." "It's a coincidence, a stolen design," Marcus blustered, his face turning ruddy. "She knew the name Seraphim Escapement," Julian pressed, his gaze cold as steel. "A name that, until this moment, I have never heard. A name that is not mentioned in any official Sterling document. But I have a feeling," he said, tapping the journal, "that it's in here." Clara took a deep breath. "It is. And so is something else." She opened the journal to the last, fateful entry. "My grandfather wrote about a visit from two men. They weren't lawyers. He called them Alistair's wolves. They threatened my grandmother and me." She looked directly at Marcus Thorne. He wrote down the date, October 12th, 1965. He also wrote down the name of the man who led them, a man named Franklin Thorne. The name landed in the silent office like a grenade. Marcus Thorne froze, the color draining from his face. Franklin Thorne was his father. Julian stared at Marcus, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with horrifying speed. The over-eagerness to handle the situation. The insistence that it was a simple shakedown. The two clean records. Marcus wasn't just protecting the Sterling legacy. He was protecting his own family's role in its corrupt foundation. The Thornes hadn't just been advisors. They had been the enforcers, the keepers of the darkest secrets. "You knew," Julian whispered, the realization dawning on him. "All this time, you knew." Marcus's mask of loyalty dissolved into a sneer of pure, cornered malice. "Knew? Of course I knew. My father protected your grandfather, and I protected his legacy from parasites like this," he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at Clara. "Alistair built an empire. Arthur Vance was a nobody, a tinkerer who got in the way of progress. He was paid for his silence. That should have been the end of it." "It wasn't a payment," Clara shot back, her voice ringing with the force of decades of injustice. "It was a gag. You didn't buy an invention. You stole a man's soul and threatened to harm his family if he cried out. My grandfather died a broken man because your father and your boss were thieves and bullies." The confrontation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Julian looked from the two identical watches on his desk, one a symbol of his family's celebrated genius, the other a testament to its secret shame, to the terrified, defiant face of Clara Sullivan, and then to the twisted, hateful face of the man he had trusted his entire life. The Sterling narrative wasn't just ironclad, it was a cage, and he had been living in it his entire life. "Get out," Julian said to Marcus, his voice a low growl of command. "Julian, you can't be serious," Marcus stammered. "You're going to throw away a century of history for the word of a waitress?" "She came with proof," Julian said, his voice rising to a roar of fury. "You came with lies. Get out. Now!" Marcus Thorne stared at him, his expression turning to one of pure contempt. He gave a sharp, formal bow that was a mockery of respect. "As you wish, but don't think this ends here. There are board members, shareholders, who believe in the Sterling legacy. They will not see it dismantled by a sentimental fool and a girl with a sob story." He turned and walked out, the heavy office doors closing behind him with a definitive thud. Silence descended. Julian sank into his chair, staring at the two watches, the twin hearts of his family story. One had ticked away the seconds of a celebrated dynasty. The other had remained silent, waiting, for over 50 years, for this single moment of truth. He looked up at Clara, who stood watching him, her expression not triumphant, but weary and sad. "My grandfather, Alistair," Julian began, the words tasting like ash. "He wasn't a visionary. He was a thief. He was your partner," Clara corrected softly, "and he betrayed him." The scale of the deception was breathtaking. It wasn't just about a watch. It was about the entire foundation of Sterling Industries. The revolutionary escapement that had made their early machinery so efficient, the microengineering patents that had launched their technology division, it all stemmed from Arthur Vance's genius. Julian's grandfather had built his empire on a stolen blueprint. The days that followed were a blur of calculated chaos. Julian, with Clara now a reluctant and unlikely ally, delved into the company's most secret archives, cross-referencing names and dates from Arthur's journals. They found it, a shell corporation, a single wire transfer for a paltry $50,000 labeled consulting fee, and a non-disclosure agreement signed by Arthur Vance. Its terms so brutal, they amounted to a lifetime vow of silence. The true battle, however, was not in the past, but in the present. Marcus Thorne, true to his word, had gone to the silence that followed Marcus Thorne's confession was not empty. It was a physical entity, a dense, heavy vacuum that sucked the air from the grand ballroom of the Pierre. For a frozen eternity, 1,000 of New York's most powerful people were suspended in it, their diamonds and champagne flutes forgotten. The only sound was the faint, amplified hum of the open microphone clipped to the lapel of a man whose world had just evaporated under the glare of his own spotlight. He stood, a statue of ruin, his face a canvas of disbelief and incandescent fury. The architecture of his lies, so carefully constructed over a lifetime, had been demolished by the raw, ugly truth of his own voice. Then the vacuum shattered. A single camera flash, sharp and intrusive, broke the spell. It was followed by another, and then a cascade of them, a silent, predatory lightning storm. The hushed murmurs began, a rising tide of whispers and speculation that would become the headline story of the decade. Julian Sterling did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the ruined man on the stage. He looked at Eleanor Vance. Tears tracked silently through the fine, papery wrinkles of her cheeks, but her eyes, for the first time in years, were utterly, heartbreakingly clear. She was not lost in the fog of a failing mind. She was present, bearing witness to a vindication she must have thought would never come. She reached a trembling hand, not for Clara, but for his. Her touch was as light as a moth's wing, yet it grounded him more than the billion-dollar fortune that now felt like a currency of shame. "Let's go home," Julian said, his voice low and steady, meant only for her and Clara. He nodded to the security detail that had materialized at his side, their presence a subtle but impenetrable wall. They moved as a single unit, a somber island in a churning sea of chaos. They didn't flee, they exited. They walked with deliberate, unhurried slowness back down the long central aisle. the whispers parting before them like water for a ship. It was not a walk of triumph. It was a funeral procession for a lie. Clara, on her grandmother's other side, held her head high, her simple black dress a stark statement of truth against the glittering artifice of the room. She was no longer a waitress from Queens. She was a historian who had just corrected the record in the most public forum imaginable. Outside, the crisp November air was a shock to the lungs. The chaos followed them, a pack of reporters held back by the hotel's frantic staff. Julian's driver had the black town car waiting, its engine a low, comforting purr. As they settled Eleanor carefully into the plush leather interior, a final venomous shout cut through the din from the hotel entrance. It was Marcus. "You've destroyed us, Julian. You've destroyed your father's name, your grandfather's memory, for nothing." Julian didn't turn. He simply looked at Clara, his glacial blue eyes holding an emotion she couldn't quite name. Not victory, not relief, but a kind of grim, terrible clarity. "He's wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper against the city's hum. "The destruction is over. The reconstruction is just beginning." The Sterling Tower penthouse had never felt so much like a cage. The panoramic view of Manhattan, a glittering tapestry of ambition and light that had always filled Julian with a sense of dominion, now felt like a monument to a colossal fraud. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his bow tie undone, watching the distant, silent flash of ambulance lights on the street below. He had spent the last 2 hours ensuring Eleanor was settled not in her old nursing home, but in a private suite at a world-class care facility with a team of the best neurological specialists on call. He had spoken with Clara, a brief logistical conversation about next steps, their words careful and measured, circling the emotional chasm that had opened before them. Now he was alone with the ghosts. He walked to the far wall, where a large commissioned oil painting of Alistair Sterling hung. His grandfather, depicted in his prime, stared out from the canvas with an expression of shrewd, unshakable confidence. He was the titan, the visionary, the myth Julian had been raised to worship and emulate. For 35 years, Julian had measured himself against this portrait, against the legend. "You were a coward," Julian said to the painting, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "Not just a thief, a coward." The silence of the room was his only answer. He felt a surge of rage so pure and violent it terrified him. It wasn't just anger at the betrayal. It was a furious grief for the man he had loved, the ideal he had believed in, which had been proven to be nothing but a hollow shell. His hand clenched into a fist. For a wild moment, he wanted to drive it through the canvas, to shatter the smug, painted face of the liar. But destruction was Alistair's way, coercion, erasure. Instead, Julian turned and walked to the climate-controlled vault. He bypassed the art, the bonds, the precious metals. He went straight to the safe that held the Valerius Continuum. He took out the watch, its platinum case cool and heavy in his palm. It was the symbol of his inheritance, the physical embodiment of the Sterling legacy. It felt unclean. He walked back to the window, the watch in his hand, and stared down at the distant glittering ribbon of the East River, 95 stories below. The thought was insane, fleeting, but powerful. To open the window and hurl the lie into the darkness, to let it be swallowed by the city it had helped build. But that too was an erasure, a denial. It was Marcus's way. Bury the evidence. Pretend it never happened. He couldn't. This watch, this beautiful tainted object, was now his burden to bear. It was the first piece of evidence in the trial of his own history. He placed it carefully on his desk, beside the worn leather journal of Arthur Vance that Clara had entrusted to him. The two objects sat there, one gleaming and perfect, the other frayed and filled with a quiet man's soul. One had kept the time of a lie, the other had kept the truth. He sank into his chair, the adrenaline of the night finally draining away, leaving behind an exhaustion that was bone deep. He had won. He had exposed the truth. And in doing so, he had orphaned himself from his own past. He was Julian, but no longer a Sterling in the way the world understood it. He was a man untethered from his own myth, floating in the silent, terrifying space between a lie he could no longer live with and a truth he didn't yet know how to inhabit. He opened Arthur Vance's journal to a random page and began to read, not for evidence, but for guidance. He needed to learn the language of the man his grandfather had tried to silence, hoping to find the schematics for building a new life. Clara stood in the doorway of her grandfather's workshop. The air still held the faint metallic scent of oil and old wood, a fragrance that had been the backdrop to her entire childhood. For the past few years, it had been a place of sorrow, a museum of a broken dream. Tonight, it felt different. It felt like a fulcrum. The entire massive weight of the Sterling Empire had pivoted on the contents of this small, dusty room. She ran a hand over the scarred surface of the workbench. Here under her fingers was where he had hunched for countless hours, his loop screwed into his eye, his hands impossibly steady, coaxing life into intricate worlds of gears and springs. She had avenged him. The thought brought not a rush of elation, but a profound, aching sadness. Justice was not a time machine. It could not restore the years of quiet despair, the light that had gone out of his eyes, the creative spark that had been smothered by a bully's threat. It could not give her back the brilliant, vibrant grandfather the world was now discovering. Her phone buzzed. It was a news alert with a picture of her, Julian, and her grandmother leaving the gala. The headline read, "Sterling Heir Detonates Family Legacy in Shocking Gala Confession." She was no longer anonymous. She had stepped out from the invisible role of a waitress into the blinding glare of a global news story. Another message came in, this one from a lawyer on Julian's team, asking for her availability to review a preliminary statement. Another from a distant cousin she hadn't spoken to in a decade. She felt a wave of vertigo. She was a student of art history, a girl who knew the difference between Rococo and Baroque, not between a hostile takeover and a proxy fight. But the battle wasn't over. The gala had been a single, decisive shelling. The war for the soul of Sterling Industries, for the meaning of her grandfather's name, would be fought in boardrooms and courtrooms, places where she was a complete stranger. She walked to the loose floorboard and pulled out the steel lockbox. Inside, Arthur's silent masterpiece lay nestled in its velvet bed. She picked it up. It was so much heavier than its twin, weighted with 50 years of silence, grief, and potential. This was her inheritance. Not money, not fame. It was a responsibility. A legacy not of what was, but of what should have been. A new lucidity seemed to have taken root in her grandmother's mind, a fragile bloom in the desolate landscape of her illness. The day after the gala, Clara sat with her in the sunroom of the new facility, overlooking a calm, gray sea. "He would be so proud, Clara," Eleanor whispered, her hand clutching Clara's. Her gaze was distant, but her thoughts were here. "Arthur, he wasn't built for fighting. He was built for creating. The fight broke his heart. He thought he had failed you." "He never failed me," Clara said, her throat tight. "I know." Eleanor smiled, a faint, beautiful thing. "When those men came, the ones from the city, they took the sound out of our house. For years it was so quiet." Arthur stopped humming at his workbench. The clocks he built seemed to tick more softly. "Last night, when you were all on that stage, I heard music again." She squeezed Clara's hand. "You gave him back his voice, my dear. You made the clock sing again." In that moment, Clara understood. Her victory wasn't for the headlines or the history books. It was for this, to restore the music to a life that had been silenced. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she would not, could not, falter in the fight to come. She would learn the language of boardrooms. She would face the lawyers and the shareholders. She had her grandfather's schematics, and for the first time, she felt she also had his resilience. The following 6 months were a brutal, grinding war of attrition. Marcus Thorne and a faction of the old guard board members, terrified of the legal and financial repercussions of the truth, fought Julian at every turn. They painted him as an emotional, reckless heir, willing to sacrifice shareholder value for a sentimental fantasy. They filed injunctions. They leaked selective, damaging documents to the press. They waged a campaign to paint Clara as a manipulative opportunist who had seduced a guilt-ridden billionaire. But they underestimated their opponents. They thought they were fighting Julian Sterling, the polished scion. They were in fact fighting Julian Sterling, the forensic analyst, who now turned his formidable intellect to dissecting his own company's history with the cold precision of a surgeon. And they were fighting Clara Sullivan, who armed herself not with legal precedent, but with her grandfather's journals. In depositions, while lawyers sparred over contractual obligations, Clara would simply read. She read passages about Arthur's excitement over a new gear ratio. She read about his admiration for Alistair's business acumen. She read his heartbroken final entry. She didn't argue. She testified. She gave Arthur Vance a voice in the rooms where he had been silenced, and her quiet, unshakable conviction was more devastating to the opposition's case than any legal maneuvering. Julian, in turn, did not just defend, he attacked. He didn't try to hide the stain on his family's name. He put it under a microscope. He commissioned a full, independent audit of the company's founding patents, methodically tracing the DNA of Arthur Vance's genius through every profitable division of Sterling Industries. The final report was a damning indictment. It proved that the company hadn't just stolen a watch design, it had stolen its entire innovative core. The Sterling Empire was built on a foundation of intellectual property theft so profound it was existential. To deny Arthur Vance was to deny the company's own success. The tipping point came during a tense, closed-door shareholder meeting. Julian, facing a vote of no confidence, didn't present a financial projection. He presented a choice. "We have two paths," he said, his voice calm, resonant. "We can follow Mr. Thorne's advice. We can bury this truth again. We can spend the next decade in litigation, fighting a battle we will inevitably lose, because the evidence is irrefutable. Our stock will plummet, our brand will become synonymous with deceit, and the ghost of this injustice will haunt every product we make. Or," he paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room, "we can do something else. We can do something that this company has not done in over 50 years. We can tell the truth." He laid out a new vision, not of damage control, but of radical restructuring, the Sterling Vance Initiative. It would begin with a public apology and full financial restitution to the Vance estate, a figure that made the board members physically flinch. But it wouldn't end there. A significant percentage of the company's annual profits would be diverted into a new, independent foundation, chaired by Clara Sullivan. Its mission, to fund and legally protect independent inventors and artisans, the Arthur Vances of the world. Sterling Industries would become their first and most powerful partner. "Our greatest innovation was a lie," Julian concluded. "Let our greatest legacy be the truth. Let the Sterling name, from this day forward, stand not for ruthless acquisition, but for radical integrity. This is not just how we survive. It's how we become worthy of surviving." It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity, and it worked. The vote of no confidence failed. The board, faced with financial ruin versus a difficult but noble path forward, chose redemption. Marcus Thorne was removed, his name and his father's expunged from the company's history with the same quiet, brutal efficiency they had once used on Arthur Vance. Spring had arrived, bringing a tentative green to the city. Julian found Clara in the workshop, which was no longer a dusty relic but a clean, organized, and living space. Light streamed through the newly washed windows, illuminating the fine, dancing dust motes. The tools were polished, the schematics carefully preserved under archival glass. It was halfway between a laboratory and a sanctuary. She was at the workbench, her brow furrowed in concentration, a loop in her eye. She was not looking at a watch, but at a complex technical proposal from a young robotics engineer in Michigan, the first applicant to the Sterling Vance Foundation. She looked up as he entered, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. The past 6 months had changed her. The uncertainty in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined competence. She wore her new authority not like a crown, but like a well-worn leather apron, practical, comfortable, and fit for purpose. "The board approved the final charter this morning," Julian said. He didn't carry a briefcase, just a small velvet-lined box. "It's done." "So it seems," Clara said, her gaze returning to the proposal in front of her. "This engineer, her designs for kinetic energy recovery are brilliant. They remind me of Grandpa's efficiency calculations for the mainspring barrel. He's a part of the company's DNA now, Julian said softly. His name is on the patents. His portrait hangs next to my grandfather's in the main lobby. He paused. I had Alistair's portrait taken down for a while, but I decided to put it back. The story doesn't make sense without both of them. The thief and the genius. The lie and the truth. It's our history now. All of it. He opened the box and placed it on the workbench. Inside, on a bed of dark blue silk, lay the two Valerius Continuum watches. His and Arthur's. The twin flames reunited. A few weeks ago, Julian began, I took my grandfather's watch, the one I wore, to our head horologist. I had him remove the seraphim escapement. He gestured to the watch on the left. It now has a standard Swiss lever escapement. It's a beautiful watch, but it's no longer a continuum. It keeps time, but it no longer holds the lie. He then pointed to Arthur's silent masterpiece. This one is complete. All the original parts are here, except one. He reached into his pocket and produced a tiny coiled piece of metal, gleaming between his thumb and forefinger. The mainspring, the heart. He looked at her, his expression one of profound earned respect. I believe its installation belongs to the head of the Vance estate and the chairwoman of our future. Clara took a deep, steadying breath. This was the final act, the closing of a circle. She picked up her grandfather's finest tweezers, the cool steel familiar and comforting, in her hand. The world outside, with its stock prices and legal battles, fell away. There was only this small, perfect universe of gears and jewels. Her movements were fluid and economical, a ballet of precision inherited through blood and memory. She carefully, expertly, fitted the mainspring into its barrel. With a fine key, she gave it a single, gentle turn. There was a soft click. And then, for the first time in over 50 years, the seraphim escapement engaged. A quiet, rhythmic pulse began, a sound so pure and steady it seemed to harmonize with the beating of her own heart. Tick, tock. It was the sound of a ghost finally given a voice, the sound of a story finally being told, the sound of time, stolen and lost, being restored. Julian leaned closer, listening. He and Clara stood side by side, their shoulders almost touching, their attention focused on the small living machine on the bench. The two watches lay together, one ticking with a common rhythm, the other with the unique, extraordinary pulse of a recovered genius. They were no longer symbols of betrayal and silence. They were a testament to a difficult history in the shared, quiet, and determined work of building a better future, one perfectly measured second at a time.